Most people believe psychological experiments happen in controlled environments, closed rooms, selected volunteers, researchers observing from behind one-way mirrors. It's a comforting image because it suggests limits, consent, and the existence of an outside. But the most effective psychological experiments in history never needed any of that. They didn't take place in laboratories. They took place across entire societies. The greatest psychological experiment ever conducted had no official beginning, no public announcement, and no formal conclusion. It wasn't designed to seek scientific answers in the traditional sense. It was designed to produce predictability. And you were never invited to participate. You were born into it. This experiment doesn't measure individual behavior alone. It observes collective patterns, how groups respond to fear, how they respond to authority, how they respond to repetition, how they respond when uncertainty becomes constant. It doesn't test intelligence, it tests adaptation. It doesn't evaluate character, it evaluates response. It doesn't try to persuade, it conditions, and it does so in an extremely subtle way. Contrary to popular belief, psychological control rarely appears as open oppression. It appears as environment. An environment where certain ideas circulate more than others, where specific themes are reinforced, where certain behaviors are rewarded, even symbolically, and others are slowly discouraged, not through punishment, but through invisibility. None of this requires brute force. It requires consistency. The experiment works because it doesn't try to change you all at once. It operates through micro-adjustments. Small concessions, small habits, small silences, until at some point what once felt unsettling begins to feel normal, and what once would have seemed absurd becomes too complex to question. This is one of the experiment's central mechanisms, the gradual transfer of critical responsibility. You are not forbidden to think. You simply learn over time to think less about certain things. Modern psychology understood something essential very early on. Human beings do not need to be convinced by truth. They need exposure to the right repetition in the right context with the right emotional tone. Repetition creates familiarity. Familiarity creates acceptance. Acceptance creates behavior, and sustained behavior becomes norm. The experiment doesn't ask whether you agree. It observes how long it takes you to adapt, how long until you stop reacting, how long until you normalize, how long until you defend something you would have questioned in another context. And this is measurable. Attention span, emotional responses, spikes of outrage, moments of apathy, mental fatigue, shifting priorities. None of this is random. When patterns are identified, they can be replicated. When replicated, they can be refined. And when refined, they can be exploited. What's most unsettling is that the experiment does not depend on a single central authority or hidden villain. It doesn't require an explicit conspiracy. It emerges naturally when systems realize that predictable behavior is more valuable than critical thought. Predictability creates stability. Stability enables control. And control rarely presents itself as control. It presents itself as organization. Within this framework, freedom still exists, but within invisible boundaries. You choose, but you choose from options already shaped. You react, but you react to carefully distributed stimuli.
You express opinions, but within narratives already in circulation. The experiment does not aim to eliminate the individual. It aims to make the individual legible. Because what can be read can be predicted, and what can be predicted can be managed. This represents a profound shift in how human beings are perceived, no longer as unpredictable subjects, but as statistical patterns, not open dehumanization, but silent abstraction. You are not ignored, you are analyzed. You are not silenced, you are integrated into the flow. Throughout the 20th century, several thinkers approached this phenomenon from different angles. Some spoke of conditioning, others of mass behavior, others of propaganda, stimulus, habit, response. No single theory explains it entirely, but together they reveal something deeply unsettling. We live within an environment that learns from our behavior in real time, and the more it learns, the less it needs to intervene directly. The experiment does not require conscious obedience. It functions best when you believe you are simply living your life. It does not impose itself, it infiltrates. And perhaps the most uncomfortable part of all this is not the existence of the experiment itself, but the fact that it only works because we collaborate with it every day, not out of malice, but out of habit, out of exhaustion, out of adaptation, out of the need to belong. The experiment doesn't ask who you are. It asks how you respond under pressure, when distracted, when saturated, when rewarded. And with each response, it learns a little more. So the question is not whether this is happening. The question is, at what point did it stop feeling strange?
There is a common mistake when people talk about psychological control. The idea that it always comes from the top, from someone giving orders, punishing, and forcing clear rules. In reality, it almost never works that way. The experiment doesn't succeed through coercion. It succeeds through adaptation. You enter a new environment, a job, a social circle, an online community, a group. At first, you observe, not consciously, automatically. Your brain does this without asking. What gets praised? What gets ignored? What creates immediate discomfort? You quickly learn where the boundaries are, and no one needs to explain them. When you say something and the atmosphere shifts, you notice. When you ask a question and receive silence, you register it. When you express an opinion and feel that subtle change, a sideways glance, a sarcastic comment, a shift in tone, the message is delivered, without words. And that matters. Because when control is not explicit, it doesn't provoke rebellion, it produces adjustment. You begin to calibrate what you say, how you say it, when you say it. Not out of direct fear, but emotional economy, belonging, exhaustion. Very few people enjoy swimming against the current all the time, and the experiment knows this. A psychologist who studied this kind of behavior once summarized the mechanism after watching people agree with something they knew was wrong. They didn't want to be right alone. That sentence isn't about stupidity, it's about isolation. The experiment doesn't test intelligence, it tests how much social discomfort you can tolerate before you yield, and almost no one tolerates much. You start repeating ideas you didn't formulate, using words you didn't consciously choose, defending positions that, if you stop to think calmly, you might not even fully agree with. But it doesn't feel like force. That's the most sophisticated part. When control is external, it generates resistance.
When it's internalized, it becomes identity. You're not obeying, you're fitting in. And the more you fit in, the stranger those who don't begin to seem. Not because they're wrong, but because they break the pattern. The experiment grows stronger when the group starts regulating itself. When other people's looks replace direct orders, when discomfort becomes punishment enough. No one needs to silence you. You learn to silence yourself. And it happens in small doses. First, you avoid a comment. Then you stop asking a question. Later, you ignore an obvious contradiction. Eventually, you start justifying things that once bothered you. Not out of malice, out of adaptation. The brain craves internal coherence. Questioning creates tension. Agreement brings relief. The experiment exploits exactly that. It doesn't demand a radical shift. It asks for constant micro-adjustments. And each adjustment makes the next one easier. Before you realize it, you've normalized things that once felt strange. You've relativized boundaries you thought were non-negotiable. You've accepted vague explanations for uncomfortable situations. And the most unsettling part, you still feel in control. That illusion is powerful. Because if you believe you chose it, you defend it. If you defend it, you rationalize it. If you rationalize it, you absorb it. And the experiment gains something extremely valuable. Not just your obedience, but your cooperation. You start correcting others, explaining the system, repeating arguments that keep everything running. Without noticing, you stop being just a participant. You become part of the mechanism. The experiment doesn't need you to do anything extreme. It only needs you to keep living normally, working, commenting, consuming, positioning yourself. Meanwhile, it watches. It watches how far you go, what you accept, what you ignore, what you justify. No crisis, no alarms, no warnings. And maybe the most uncomfortable question isn't who is behind this, but a far more personal one. At what point did you stop noticing you were adapting and start calling it a choice? At some point, the experiment stopped being something observable and began to merge with the environment itself. There was no announcement, no clear beginning, no authority ever declared that it had started, and yet its effects began to accumulate. What once felt like exception slowly became standard. What once caused discomfort began to feel reasonable, not because it was true, but because it was repeated inside a system that rewards predictability and quietly penalizes friction. This kind of experiment does not rely on direct coercion. It relies on context, on framing, on how choices are presented before they are ever made. The sense of freedom remains intact, while the range of acceptable options narrows almost imperceptibly. Psychologist B.F. Skinner observed something similar when he argued that human behavior can be shaped without the individual ever perceiving the structure that conditions it. Orders are unnecessary when the environment itself produces the desired response. The experiment works like this. You still choose, but only among options already filtered. You still speak, but you adjust tone, timing, and setting. You still think, but gradually learn which thoughts are socially neutral and which carry symbolic cost. This is not explicit censorship. It is internal calculation. Over time, self-correction replaces external enforcement. The individual learns to anticipate reactions, to measure consequences, to avoid friction. Silence begins to look like maturity. Adaptation begins to resemble emotional intelligence. At that point, the experiment reaches a deeper level. It no longer needs constant surveillance because it has been internalized. The mind begins operating within limits that feel natural but were constructed. Certain ideas stop being explored, not because they were disproven, but because they became inconvenient. Certain questions are not forbidden, they simply become too exhausting to sustain. Philosopher Michel Foucault described this dynamic when analyzing systems of power that operate not through force, but through normalization. When the norm becomes invisible, it ceases to feel like control. And that is where the experiment becomes most efficient. It does not require universal agreement. It only needs an environment where dissent demands extra effort, where questioning carries emotional, social, or professional cost, where repetition offers comfort and doubt exacts a toll. In such a system, conformity does not emerge as submission, it emerges as psychological economy. The experiment does not demand total obedience. It functions better when it allows controlled divergence, when it offers outlets, when it turns critique into style while neutralizing its impact. The feeling of participation remains, the feeling of autonomy remains, but the center has already shifted. The most unsettling aspect is that none of this requires a single malicious mind orchestrating it. The experiment does not need an author. It sustains itself through incentives, diffuse fears, and incremental adaptations. Each individual adjusts behavior, believing they are simply being cautious. The accumulation of these adjustments produces a collective pattern, and the pattern begins to feel natural. Perhaps the most disturbing realization is not the possibility of large-scale manipulation, but how quietly it dissolves into routine, not as something imposed, but as something learned, a gradual alignment between what is thought, what is said, and what is avoided. The experiment does not rely on constant monitoring. It relies on adaptation, on small daily concessions that feel insignificant in isolation, but together redraw the boundaries of what feels possible. It does not require full agreement, only quiet disagreement. It does not require belief, only restraint. It does not require abandoning critical thought, only practicing it where it creates no friction. At this stage, control is no longer external. It operates as habit, as convention, as a form of symbolic self-preservation. And perhaps this is where the experiment becomes most effective, when it no longer needs to be recognized in order to continue. Because the true limit is not enforced by visible rules, but by the subtle sense that some questions simply cost too much to ask. And when thinking begins to demand too much effort, repetition offers relief. The experiment does not end when someone realizes they are inside it. It only changes shape. Reaching the end of this path does not mean escaping the experiment. It only means seeing it more clearly. Because the most sophisticated feature of this system is not direct manipulation, but the absence of a visible center. There is no obvious control room, no single authority to point at, no clearly defined they. The experiment works precisely because it seems to have no author. When something has no face, it rarely provokes immediate resistance. What exists instead is a convergence of interests, fears, incentives, and habits that reinforce one another. An environment where certain behaviors are rewarded while others become too costly to maintain, where constant adjustment feels like prudence, where caution is mistaken for maturity. The philosopher Hannah Arendt observed that the most efficient systems of control do not rely on permanent terror, but on gradual normalization. When the exceptional becomes routine, the capacity for estrangement weakens, and without estrangement, there is no rupture. At this stage, the experiment no longer needs to persuade, it simply sustains itself. People continue to believe they are choosing freely, and in a sense they are, but always within boundaries that were set long before the choice appeared. The feeling of autonomy remains intact, even as the range of possible actions quietly narrows. And the more this happens, the harder it becomes to notice. What is most unsettling is that this process does not require explicit malice. It thrives on good intentions, on the desire to avoid conflict, on the need for belonging, on the pursuit of stability. Each individual concession feels small, but together they reshape collective behavior. The experiment does not demand that you lie. It only asks that you choose carefully what is worth saying. It does not require you to abandon your beliefs, only to learn when it is more convenient to keep them silent. It does not impose a single worldview. It merely determines which views move without friction and which encounter constant resistance. And so, little by little, adaptation begins to feel like personal choice. Perhaps the most disturbing realization is this: there is no clear moment of submission, no precise point where someone realizes they have crossed a line. The process is continuous, diffuse, reversible only in theory. Because questioning the system requires energy, and most people are too exhausted to sustain questions that offer no immediate reward. The experiment survives because it does not present itself as an experiment. It presents itself as reality, as common sense, as the way things work. And that leads to an unavoidable question. If no one seems to be in charge, if no one claims authorship, if everyone is merely adjusting, who then is in control? Perhaps the most unsettling answer is that control does not belong to an entity, but to the mechanism itself. A system that persists because it offers just enough comfort to be accepted and just enough pressure to be obeyed. A fragile balance between fear and convenience. The experiment does not require enthusiastic participation, only continuity. And it does not end with awareness. Seeing it does not dismantle it. At best, it creates internal friction, a discomfort that is difficult to sustain for long, because living outside constant adjustment demands effort. In the end, the central question is not whether you are inside the experiment. That is already settled. The real question is this: how often are you willing to notice the difference between adapting and being shaped? Because the greatest psychological experiment ever conducted does not need to be imposed. It works best when it is accepted. And what is accepted without resistance rarely needs to be defended.